Hey everybody, today we have Josh, who's a friend of mine who I consider a very thoughtful thinker, who I last caught up with about a year and a half ago in Ukraine.
Mhm.
And basically, you recently got banned off of Facebook, so we want to hear about that, why that happened, and get more of your ideas on this time because it's been a year and a half, and the world has changed quite a bit since we last talked. So, Josh, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Cool. Thanks, Eric. So, like you said, my name is Josh Nadeau, and I'm originally from Canada, but I've spent most of the past 8 years in East Europe, mostly Russia and Ukraine, also the Balkans and Central Asia.
Yeah.
Right now, I am a grad student. I'm studying conflict studies. And so, as a practitioner, I'm mostly kind of focused on, yeah, these kinds of post Soviet conflicts.
Yeah.
But as a researcher, what I'm really fascinated by is whether or not we can take the tools and paradigms that we've learned when talking about armed conflicts and apply it to social conflicts. So, for example, I'm really interested in this kind of post 2015 North America, like Trump debacle, all this stuff that's kind of connected to that. Like, how can we start talking about those kinds of like sociocultural political conflicts using some of the insights we've gained from thinking about war?
Wow.
Yeah, so that's kind of like where I'm focused on. And also as a practitioner, I'm really kind of like the main discourse I use is dialogue. So how do you depolarize highly polarized groups? How do you build bridges? How do you create linkages between communities who may or may not find each other threatening? And so
Yeah.
that's kind of another interest in that. I would also clarify as well. So there's a very like, and I learned this like I had to learn this very quickly. There's this kind of like different words that people use to talk about like how Facebook treats us. So in terms of banned, disabled, blocked, these different kinds of things. So my account was disabled by
Okay.
Facebook, and so what that means is that because there was because basically either a bot or a human flagged my account as having violated the community guidelines, and we'll talk about more about that in a minute. It basically deleted the account, but it didn't ban me from the network, which would mean that I couldn't get back in.
Hmm.
So yeah, so ban is like total ban. Like disable is like, oh, your account is gone, you'll have to start a new one. And then blocking is usually temporary. So they flagged something and they block you until they're able to evaluate whether, like, what they should do next.
All
So
right. So I guess what people most would be interested in hearing, Reddit, what did you do that's so bad in Facebook land?
uh, so um, I mentioned earlier that I'm really interested in dialogue, and one project that I have is called Kitchen Talks. And what Kitchen Talks is so we organize meetings either like a couple times a month or every week where we basically try to talk about controversial subjects. So this was something that I was doing in Russia for the past few years, mostly in St. Petersburg, where I'm more often based. And so I started doing it in Ottawa, back in Canada, where I'm doing my master's right now. So I started like the North American Kitchen Talks back in November, and so we've been talking about like the vaccine, about Trump's legacy, about like political anxieties, and so basically things started going wrong when I posted when I created an event where we would discuss conspiracy theories and in particular QAnon. And the issue is that when I made a post describing the event, like a part of what I tried to do is I tried to have like a bit of a longer post to describe not just the topic but the conversation around the topic. So what are the different sides? What are different people saying? And then I tried to include links, about 5 links that try to give different perspectives on that. And
Oh,
so and it's interesting, like so basically what I assume happened, because Facebook doesn't give you information, I assume that the post basically had enough kind of red flag keywords that they thought that I was promoting QAnon content. And then so they basically disabled my account. And this is because like this is in response to a number of different things. So um back in 2016, when Trump was elected, Facebook and YouTube and a lot of these different platforms were accused of kind of allowing for extreme content to be kind of not only proliferated, but just kind of unregulated. And there were some interest groups, both activists, but also some people in government that were like, oh, like should Facebook be considered a public space and should it be regulated? And so they received a lot of heat for that, particularly with how, especially when you're watching on YouTube, if you're watching a certain kind of video, the algorithms might actually predict that you'll engage on the platform more if you're shown a slightly more radical video, a slightly more polarizing video. And so there was this kind of conversation happening that said, oh, YouTube is actually potentially radicalizing people, because you might watch, if we talk about kind of more right-leaning or libertarian content, right, you might start watching a video on Jordan Peterson, and then be led to, for example, Breitbart, and then be led to like the Daily Storm, or like, just, you know what I mean? So like this was one of the big concerns that certain people had in the wake of the 2016 election, especially because social media was seen as a place where meddling might have happened, or people might be engaging not in good faith and stuff like that. So Facebook, I like, as far as I kind of like, my take on it is that Facebook upped their regulation in order to respond to those claims, whether or not they did it out of an actual concern to kind of create a better public space, or if they did it just to kind of get critics off their back. Like, we don't know. We can have our own interpretations of that. So when I tried to appeal my disabling, I got a message that said I couldn't, because they had increased the regulations in November 2020, during the 2020 election, regarding politicized content. And so things, or certain kinds of politicized content. And so that includes QAnon stuff, especially after the incident at the Capitol at January 6th,
Sure.
where people kind of entered the Capitol in a kind of a violent manner, and QAnon content has been associated with that kind of, this call to arms and different things like this. And so this is, as far as I understand, the background context to why Facebook reacted so strongly to my post. But that creates a problem, because then if things like this are regulated by bots, then there's no space to appeal situations like mine, where the purpose isn't to promote content, but to create dialogue. And so that's kind of the long version of
So yeah, there's
this.
always that sort of weird juxtaposition between enforcement of laws and the values that lead to them being passed and stuff like that. But okay, so let's go back a little bit and talk about the sort of roots of this current information landscape that we're in, and basically how do because from my perspective, it's like this is a reaction of people no longer feeling that the system and the information that's put through it, specifically the mainstream media, is trustworthy.
Mhm.
What would you say about that? And like,
So, yeah.
and then social media presents a whole other set of problems as the place where people then have freedom to expose all these counter narratives that they might be entertaining, and having to police, because obviously mainstream media is problematic because it's all based on advertising, right?
Mhm.
And so is Facebook, in fact, and
Mhm.
YouTube, and all of these platforms are, it's all based on money. And I feel like a lot of society has lost anything but that in the age of digital marketing and all this stuff. It's all just like spiraling out of control. And can you understand that like, it's hard to find truth in this world, and it's even harder when there's like these, and if for example you're somebody who is less grounded in reality, then it's hard to find truth in the world. But especially if you find these enticing conspiracy theories that sort of correspond with a narrative that you might feel in your heart, and then all of that stuff. So what did you want to achieve by this conversation of conspiracy theories, and what sort of conversation did you end up having the event, and what kind of conversation did you want to have there? Because I know that your intent is 100% honest truth seeking, whereas like and you're put up against this corporate sort of machine that spit you out in their regulation like of ideas. So did you end up having this thing, and what kind of thought did you intend to share there?
Um, there's a lot in what you just said to
Yeah,
unpack.
sorry.
So no worries, no
That's
worries.
how
So
my
I'm
mind
just,
works. So we just take
yeah,
it piece by
yeah,
piece.
yeah. So I think my response might be also a little kind of
Cool.
unwieldy. I think there's a couple things like before, like I think to ju- to answer the question about whether or not the event went forward, it did. Uh, I was like, luckily I kind of like I asked for people to register on a different platform, and so you get all their contact information and stuff like that, and so I was able to message everybody like that. But obviously, it affects the ability for new people to like discover projects and conversations like that. And actually, one thing that was really interesting when I did eventually get back on Facebook, and it was like this very Kafka-esque process where like I tried to get on in different ways, and it blocked me again, or like did this or did that, and it was actually kind of scary because it was really concerning how powerful some of these algorithms were. So like I would give like a different email address and like a different birthday, but it would still know it was me, and it would like combine that like account to my old one and like block it all together. And like I would like I had to eventually put in information that was so far detached from like who I am before I would escape that. So like there's that element as well, which is like really um so it's really of concern as well, because like so I also work in like the Russian context where like there's a direct link between the government, or not directly, but like there's alleged links between like the government and say like the people who are running the main social network there, right? And so like the kind of power that's behind these algorithms, if put into particular hands, is could be concerning to certain groups. But I did get back on eventually, and when I did, um, I reposted, like I recreated the event, but I put like asterisks instead of like letters, just to kind of try to not get the same attention. But Facebook still flags certain things as spam. Like it was just a very kind of like
Yeah.
very long process. But we did eventually have the meeting. And when you're asking about like about what the point of it is, or like what kind of happens in meetings like this. So you mentioned this idea of truth seeking. Um, Projects like this are less about truth seeking,
Okay.
and they're more about I would say one is like building relationships. So part of like this depolarization is like, okay, so how do you get people into the same room talking to each other and like not seeing each other as like a villainized other? So like that's, if that can happen, that's already like a huge plus. Another thing is before you can even start talking about truth seeking, you have to kind of get a grip on what narratives um, are in the room. And so that's kind of the second thing. Like, and I think for me, a big sign of success is if like civil conversation kind of happens, and if people can appreciate each other as human beings. And this other thing is if people walk away from a conversation with a better idea of what the narratives are, and what the context in the conversation is. Because I think that, well, number one, our meetings are only about 2 hours, and you can't like the world is so complex and these issues are so complex that we can't just come to an idea of what the facts or what the truth is if we think, if we frame it in terms of truth. So but the next, like one of the next best things is trying to understand like why other people believe what they do,
Mhm.
because I think that that's going to better help us to engage with those people outside of these safer contexts, because most engagement that does happen is in contexts where it is a bit more triggering. So you mentioned like talking to people on Facebook, like that's like, or on all kind of text-based like social media frameworks. It's very hard for a number of reasons that have been researched and very well documented. Um, so yeah, so I think that the idea of truth and narrative is really important while talking about this, because you also, another thing I wanted to go back to is you mentioned like mainstream media and like how it's problematic. I would say that all media is problematic, and even words like mainstream media are coded and charged in a certain way,
Yeah, sure.
right?
Yeah.
And it's also a narrative, right? And there's some people that use the word mainstream media to delegitimize a hugely diverse set of media sources, some of which have like incredibly nuanced reportage, right? And so like, but it's so hard to say, okay, so these are all the different outlets, and here are all the different writers, here are the better writers, here are the writers who are normally good, but maybe in this context they're not so good. So like it's so hard to come to truth in that context, that like, for example, when somebody presents a narrative like mainstream media is this or that, like the dialogue perspective and the narrative perspective would come in there saying, okay, so how can we at least angle ourselves a bit like better to even get at a conversation like that? Because also a lot of people feel very threatened, for example, by different developments that have been happening. So if we want to talk about media, it's like threatened by the fact that they don't know where to go for information, and they don't know where to go to not have spin, like, which is exactly what we're talking about, right?
Which is
And so
great. That's
that's
why
a,
I love YouTube, is because you can actually, yeah, be it with it may as the algorithms how they're showing you stuff, but if you do know how to select content based on your own sort of need to understand the world, it can be very fruitful. But I understand that, not everybody is as much of a thinker as I am, and people in a lot of cases just want the world to be explained to them so that they can believe something and go on with their lives, right?
and I think a lot of it too, and like obviously like in the same way the word like mainstream media is very charged, another charged word in the opposite direction is privilege, right?
Yeah.
And these structures of privilege and structures of power, some people would frame the time and the resources and the energy they have to engage with media and with information is also sometimes is an element of privilege. Some people might not have the resources or the media literacy or the time or the money to not be working to sit down to actually ask these questions too, right? So it's not only like people are looking at things differently, but some people, just by the nature of where they're positioned, like might not even have the basics to like really sort through a lot of this stuff. And
And
so
so they're
that's,
they're
yeah,
susceptible to lower resolution narratives that are just
yeah,
going to,
yeah.
yeah.
And there's this really great term that I learned this year, and I've read a bit about it. It's called epistemic vulnerability.
Yeah.
And there are people that are basically doing research about what makes certain, for example, like certain people more epistemically vulnerable than others, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Which is
To
basically
problematic
just means that
narratives, or
your
yeah.
yeah your narrative can be hijacked with someone by someone with an agenda.
Not even that. It's like, because like I get, yes, actually it is like it's just your vulnerability to that threat,
Yeah.
right? Maybe that threat will never happen. Maybe you'll be surrounded by good information, but like if you're more vulnerable than other people, then it's likely that in the event that problematic narrative comes around, you might be like your discourse might be hijacked by that,
But
and
in
that
this
can,
landscape, it's much more likely to happen than it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, in some way.
yeah, yeah, like they're like, for example, social media is like a huge element of it, because the algorithms, when they're optimized for engagement, um, and if polarized behavior results in more engagement, then the algorithm is going to optimize for that, right? But that's just one element of that too, right? Like another element is this cultural polarization that we're seeing, right? This lack of trust, this like idea of where do we go to for information? Who can I trust? Who's dangerous? Whose ideas are dangerous, right? And because we have this polarization, we have two very different, at least two, and like lots of camps within those camps, but like at least two camps with very different ideas of who is dangerous and why, and what's threatening and why.
And
For some people, yeah.
so yeah, my goal is always to understand as many contradictory perspectives as possible, which I think
Mhm,
is why you would have a forum about conspiracy theories, to understand
mhm,
the contradictory ideas, and to have both sides, or as many sides as possible at the table, to see if you can have people connect the dots for each other, and sort of like,
mhm,
yeah. So, I mean, how do you do that in this landscape? I mean, other than having events with people that you know,
mhm.
and people who are emanating from your social circle coming in, and
Yeah.
yeah, uh, and having talks like this and making them public so that
Mhm,
people can watch them. But with contradictory ideas, it's like, yeah, contradictory ideas are hard to sell, let's say,
mhm,
because they don't have this emotional drama component to the narrative as the typical us versus them narrative. Like if you have this sort of like well, it's a bunch of individuals on this planet who are in various degrees and various locations and various times organizing into various collectives and stuff like that, but no one person knows everything, and everybody has to continue to get a higher resolution of thinking on the world if they want to get closer to
Mhm.
something that's actually serviceable in reality, let's say.
Yeah. And like again, there's so much to unpack in like what you're mentioning.
I take that as a
For one,
compliment.
there's
Thank you.
like for one thing, there's this dilemma that you're talking about. Okay, so like there's these things that happen on a in a context of small groups or like in an individual dialogue, let's say, right? And like like how do you how do you take that model and apply it to like a culture or like a subculture or like a large group? And like that's kind of one of the $1 million questions that people are trying to understand. And when I'm talking about like how do we take the stuff we've learned in the context of armed conflict and apply it to these social conflicts, like that's like one big area of that is this dialogue thing, right? Like if we can have dialogue between particular people, what does it mean to have large groups in dialogue? What does it mean to have dialogue in media? What does it mean to try to put these different narratives in dialogue with each other? Like, and we still don't understand all the dynamics of how that might work. But there's a lot of interesting research about why like about what's in the way, you know. And a big part of that is there's like for example, there's like an evolutionary psychologist might talk about how like not just it's not just like the social media has optimized algorithms, but it's our brains,
Yes.
you know. And so we have like we ourselves are optimized to respond to threat. Um, and that sometimes means that we might perceive things to be threats that and those certainly may not correspond to what we call reality or the facts, right? And so there's this basically this is what it means to be triggered. And so our brains are very good at being triggered because that's what meant survival in the past, right? And so like survival at the cost of maybe getting a nuanced perspective of certain things. And I don't know if you've read Daniel Kahneman, like this Thinking
No.
Fast and Slow stuff, but it's a very popular kind of like he talks about like the system one, system two thinking. Like system one is like fight or flight, right? System two is deliberative,
So
slower,
it's
this
like
sort of
integral
thing.
theory. Like, have you heard of spiral dynamics?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So that's my main lens through which I look at this, and I like
Mhm.
to be on system two, yellow, on spiral dynamics, looking at
Yeah.
the contradictory perspectives and trying to understand the different people
Mhm.
at the different levels, from red until green, basically.
Mhm. Yeah.
And that's what's useful for me to understand where people are at, and basically all of this narrative right now, it basically what it boils down to on spiral dynamics is you've got people in Western civilization who are still in blue, a lot who are in orange. Blue is a collectivist stage, orange is an individual stage, and green is a collectivist stage, and it's a really awkward transition between orange and green right now, in my
Mhm.
opinion. And where we haven't really started to embody green as a society,
Mhm.
but those ideas are entering the whole thing, but it's just so awkward. And I
Yeah.
think
And
yeah, this, but the integral, like, and they say that people on the integral, yeah, the tier 2 thinking are like 1% of people, but they wield a greater amount of influence in the world. And what you kind of hope is that politicians and people who are making decisions that impact society are somehow able to consider things on this level, but in a lot of cases it seems like it's not really facilitated by the sort of election cycles, and
mhm.
and the corporate profit imperatives and all this stuff.
Mhm.
So that's why people are mistrustful as well of the system.
Like I think like I guess one like I think talking about like the spiral dynamics would be a whole other thing because I have a lot of issues with how that paradigm is presented,
Okay.
and I think that the way that it's set up or the way that it's communicated often contributes to polarization. But I think it's a whole other kind of topic. But I would agree that there's this that a lot of different paradigms and systems are talking about this difficulty of how to go from like one mode of thinking, this reactive thinking, into more like deliberative, you know, and a lot of like basically what everybody's saying is that like a lot, like one of the barriers that prevents us from from like exiting one area of like thinking or reacting or being into the other is a sense of threat. And the more threatened that a lot of people feel, the less like the harder it is for people to enter into a deliberative state without training, basically, or without
Yeah,
practice,
I mean, like I feel like I am able to entertain these types of ideas and sit here on a Monday evening and have this nice little intellectual conversation is because
Mhm.
I've first of all, I've got a very privileged upbringing, being a upper middle class guy from Canada basically,
Mhm.
and I've built a business that I I don't feel threatened by the current crisis. In fact, it's been good for
Mhm.
my business. But you can see how a lot of people who do feel threatened by, for example, lockdowns, and do feel threatened by, whatever else
Mhm.
is in this current situation that seems to threaten their livelihood, and
Mhm.
that's my heart goes out to them. And but
Mhm.
how do you get those people to the table and get them out of that survival narrative?
So I think this is actually what my research is about. But so we can think about like in conflict studies, one way that we frame responses to threats is through something like, or responses to violence or anything like that, is that we say that there's two kinds of peace: negative peace and positive peace. And this negative peace is the absence of violence, whereas positive peace is the presence of infrastructure that will basically create a society where the violence isn't necessary. So if we kind of simplify it, it's just like one response is there's a threat, I need to get rid of the threat. And that could be through ceasefires, it could be through avoiding the person, you know what I mean? Like it's that. Whereas the other side is, well, okay, I need to engage with the dynamics that are threatening so that the threat won't exist anymore. You know, like resolve all those root kind of causes, if possible,
Yeah.
right? And when we're talking about like and this positive peace paradigm, the system to this, I forget like if it was like blue or green, like this kind of like all this kind of stuff can sometimes lead to a group of people being like, oh, we need to do this. Everyone over here on this negative piece, system one, fight or flight, reactive, threatened, like they need to just get on the bus. You know what I mean? And there can be this
Right.
kind of
But
mentality. And I would challenge that in the sense that there
that's
can be,
collectivism. That's collectivism. That's the collectivist narrative, is it's us versus them, and you're with us or against us sort of thing. Right?
yeah, and like the way that that manifests itself in this kind of like positive peace system to deliberative thing is like we need to get all these threatened triggered people, like we need to drag them, you know, to our side, and to realize that actually that like they need to like,
Well,
and that's a
actually,
problem.
no, 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 no. The system two actually encourages an understanding of why people are the way they are.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh,
And so it's like, okay, so these people are a nationalist, collectivist, traditional society, and guess what? They're racist because that's part of their cultural narrative, is that their society made itself in contrast to other things, and being a part of that collective is what gives them strength, and
mhm.
all of that. That's the blue. That's the stage blue. And
Yeah.
coming from integral thinking, from the tier two one, you can actually look at that and say, okay, these people are like that. And what you need to do to move them further is get them into orange, meaning give them a sense of individual prosperity, where they can make
Mhm,
money and start stabilizing economically and becoming affluent. And then they will
mhm,
no longer be tempted towards going to war with other nations or fighting for their
mhm.
religion. And so those ideas will start to become a little bit obsolete because they're actually given a better method to ensure their survival.
Yeah, and that's exactly what like I guess I should qualify what I was trying to say before, is that like I like there's like what you're saying is like I very much agree that this is part of the like that's the kind of style of approach that I think is really necessary. Um, Another kind of approach that I think is more problematic is when you have these like engagers who are like, we just need to engage and get everybody on board and stuff, who don't respect the fact, don't respect enough the fact that these other triggered people feel threatened. And so there's kind of this desire to bring peace without actually like like really engaging with the fact that why these people don't want peace. Maybe they don't want peace because they think these guys are like freaking dangerous, you know, and
Yeah,
I don't want to
well,
touch them.
I
You know
mean
what I mean? And so it's like
yeah.
getting it, like trying to engage with and resolve the factors that lead to threat and lead to triggering. For example, you talked about economic prosperity. And if we want to bring this back to this kind of Facebook cancel culture, like who's banned, who's not banned, like framework, we have a polarized culture that has very different values and interpretations of what is or is not threatening,
That's
right?
because, yeah, of the green narrative, which is post-capitalist, right?
Mhm,
So you've got these people who, like, capitalism doesn't actually bring long-term happiness, prosperity. You know, you get so rich, you're so hardworking, so individualist, you make all your money,
mhm,
but then you start to be aware of a lack of actual connection to other human beings, and this is the awkward
mhm,
transition that basically this is why you will see that you know, the people who are going and becoming more activist and
mhm,
sort of social justice are actually the upper middle classes of North America and Western Europe, for example. Those people, having secured their affluence and realized that having a bunch of money didn't make them happy, they start to have concerns for other people's well-being, and that gets enters from the orange to the green stage, which then actually just you know, it's another collectivist stage which has its own problems, but it's the next thing, you know, it's the
mhm,
next thing, and it's the next
mhm,
collectivism, it's the next us versus them, and that's where you get this idea of cancel culture and all this stuff is
mhm,
when you start to have this post-capitalist sort of thing, like if everybody has enough food to eat and everybody's, you know, reasonably successful, then we'll have a better world. But as long as you still have poverty, inequality that is a result of the capitalist system, which is competitive and has people trying to make more money and do better than the neighbors, have more shiny objects than the neighbors and all that stuff, then you will have that inequality, and we have a very awkward world that is based on that inequality now. But by the measure of history, we have a better world now than we ever did before. But there's
mhm.
still so much inequality to sort of address.
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point in talking about how at all these different stages, there are very different kind of like ideas of what the struggle is. So if there are these, and like it's a very interesting kind of criticism that's being leveled at kind of this like middle class North American wokeness. You know, that's it's very much kind of based like that it itself is fueled by a certain
It's
amount of like
predicated
privilege,
on
right?
affluence. It's
Yeah,
predicated on a
yeah,
material
yeah,
security that
and
allows you to even think about the well-being of people who are not immediately part of whatever group you're a member of, or
yeah, and
yourself, more
I think that
specifically.
that's a big part of things, but I think there's also like that also ignores like a lot of kind of like what does lower middle class or like working class activism look like, which is also still very like a thing and very powerful. But like I think that's a conversation for another day. But I would say that because these different classes with different levels of influence frame the conversation in different ways.
Well, we've seen with
Um,
working class activism that it leads to things like Trump and Brexit, and
mhm,
that's receding back into the collectivist nationalist stage.
yeah, and like
From
but
the, you know,
mhm,
people felt like there was a society, it did have individual rights, but then the inequality like slanted in such a way that they were just thrown
mhm,
back down into you know, having ideas about us versus them, rather than
mhm.
this is a fair system where I can have my individual life. And that's Trump and
Yeah,
Brexit in a nutshell.
I would I would say that the middle class and the working class are a bit more diverse
Hmm.
than that in the sense of
Yes,
like
of
it's I think it's
course.
easy to fall into like I think it's easy to talk about narratives like oh like working class and Trump and like middle class and kind of like Democrat and kind of like identity politics and stuff, and those are very true things. There's more to it than that,
Yeah, it's
but like
always, I
it's
always like to start with the idea of just like we're going deeper in resolution as we discuss things. So go ahead.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that one thing that's really interesting about that dynamic like right now is that for example in the 19th century like leftism was about class. You know what I mean? Whereas like kind of now North American leftism is like about identity. And because identity is not on the radar for a lot of people who are in like certain disadvantaged situations, that like it's hard for them to take that demand seriously. And so when they see, for example, Facebook regulating content based on identity concerns, like this further generates this, oh, it's biased, it's this, it's that, it's mainstream media, it's this. And so just like all because they're different actors are playing basically like talking about like completely different stuff, and there's no linkages, like there's very little linkages between them. Like this is also why polarization is exacerbating. And so to get back to your original question about what can we do, what can be done to try to create those linkages and stuff like that. It's like these are the dynamics that need to be named, and we're still starting to name them, and there's not a systematized way of talking about this yet. And that's like, obviously that's not going to solve these problems, but like it might at least channel a lot of this energy and a lot of this desire to address the situation into ways that might be a bit more constructive.
Yeah, I mean, it's like there's so much nuance to humanity. There's so
Mm.
much nuance to beliefs, and any sort of narrative is always trying to simplify things for people, right? And we're all guilty of this. We are all guilty of wanting to believe something that's convenient to believe so we can go on and live our life and, keep on edging towards our survival or prosperity or, our community, bettering our community. So let's get to the biggest topic of our time, coronavirus and the response to it and all that stuff. Let's talk about the kinds of narratives that are out there about this, actually, because
Mhm.
this is the one that I think is going to be, with us for decades, and to make an accurate depiction of how it looks to us right now, it might be interesting to look back on in the future. So what what would you say, if you can be honest? I can do the same. I can go first if you want. What is the dominant narrative in your mind about the coronavirus situation right now?
Um, like about like what it is or how it works or what's going to happen. Like,
About the conflict, and
okay.
the sort of like way that society's dealing with it. The I mean, should I go first or do you want to go first?
What I like like one thing that's interesting about the events that I run these kitchen talks is that sometimes we try to create like maps of the conversation and the conflict involved. So we actually had one about the vaccine recently, and we one thing that we did was we tried to build like a map of the different narratives that were kind of in conflict and why. And we found that a lot of the narratives that we were kind of talking about had like they focused around like it seems like a lot of these narratives can deal around like fear, like ideas of moral judgment. What are the consequences of something like this? Like who do we distrust? And so for me, a lot of like the narratives are like a lot of the conflicting narratives are kind of based around stuff like that. So it's like who is at fault for doing what?
Yeah.
Like who is responsible? Um, who do we trust and why? Who is afraid of what? And so just myself, like the things that I've been seeing, and I'm obviously like limited in what I can see. Like I saw a lot of kind of narratives around like what we would kind of call conspiracy theory at the beginning, especially with like pandemic and things like that. That I find has like died down, and it's more focusing now on who may stand to benefit from the vaccines,
Yeah.
and whether or not there's information that's being withheld from us,
Yeah.
and whether or not, yeah, like stuff like that. Like those, like that right now seems to be like a really relevant conflicting set of narratives.
So yeah, okay. So you don't seem to like, you seem like you're intellectually disseminating the situation, and I'm trying to do so as well. But my basic opinion on the whole thing is I don't know. I really don't know if I should be afraid of this thing at all. It looks like I'm not in any risk of having serious consequences if I get coronavirus, as many people I know have, and I might have even
Mhm.
had it already because I've been around people who then a couple days later tested positive. Who knows? I got an antibody test in November, negative, but who even knows? Do I want to
Mhm.
get a vaccine right now? Not really. Do I think
Mhm.
that the people who are selling the vaccines are partly motivated by profit? Absolutely. And do I think that their sort of resolution of thinking on the thing is kind of a little bit biased, and that they're following a narrative that benefits them? Yes, and all human beings do. So I'm kind of like, I'm chilling for now. I'm careful to a reasonable degree, but I still will do things like meet up with people and have kitchen talks, as you say, with usually one-on-one. Maybe I'll meet 5 people one-on-one in a week, maybe as many as 10 people, I don't know. And every time I go in the supermarket, I'm happy to wear a mask if that's what people think is helping out. And I don't know if it helps. I honestly don't know. I carry around hand sanitizer on my backpack, so anytime I feel I touch something or something, I can just get a squirt. And I feel that I've got a very neutral sort of like, let's wait and see sort of attitude. If and I know that vaccines do have side effects, and it's pretty obvious that the companies that sell them, um, based on the previous sort of experiences in the pharmaceutical industry, they are profit driven. They do have boards of directors that demand more profits, and a lot of people in that industry have sort of basically had the opinion that if we need to pay out 200 million in lawsuit settlements, I'm just approximating, but to get $1 billion or 2 billion of revenue, then that's fine. And we're doing, the work of science and stuff like that. But I don't know where the virus came from. I don't know, and it's like, I just want to wait and see what the world looks like. And in the meantime, I'm just mostly staying home. And I'm, going out when I can, when it's a nice day outside, and I still travel. I went to Mexico for 2 months, and I'm not afraid for my own personal health. I'm afraid for my parents, my grandmother, that I'll never see her again because I didn't make it home for Christmas this year because I didn't like the idea of going in quarantine for 2 weeks in Canada. And it's kind of like a weird sort of thing because, yeah, I don't really have trust in the narrative of the pharmaceutical companies and the way that they've proven themselves to behave around profits and the ways that they've impacted people's lives in the past, and being able to just write that off and stuff. But at the same time, I really hope that this vaccine does get rid of, because here in Serbia, like right now, it's just lots of cases and stuff, and lots of people have died, and I know people whose grandmother has died and all that stuff, and it seems very real. But yeah, I guess the main core of my issue is like, I live in a country here in Serbia where I feel that the powers and the motivations behind them are more visible.
Yeah.
And, like, rather than the nanny state, it's kind of like the bully state. I don't know how to describe it. Whereas, like, it's very upfront, and you can see it's a small country, and you can see who's in charge and what motivates them. And it's all kind of, whereas in Canada, I always felt like that was a little bit obscured behind a sort of wall of just the culture was less upfront about the power system. And it did actually result in a system that gave everybody a chance to have a decent life. At the same time, I don't feel that with these lockdowns that now everybody really has a chance to have a decent life the same way they did previously. And I understand politicians have a very difficult job right now to consider the benefits of lockdowns and the benefits of lockdowns versus the benefits of just letting the virus go and dealing with the aftermath, the bodies and whatever. But I do know that these governments are lobbied by the large companies who are making a shit ton of money these days. And that's kind of like, the inequality is definitely growing. You can see it. It's very clear that inequality is growing as the result of the restrictions and all that stuff, and that the politicians have really shown that it's politically convenient for them to stay on the side of that rather than entertaining the other stuff. So I don't know. What are the red flags in what I just said?
Like, no, I think it's all just like, I think when we're all in this position of, like, we're all being forced to like, we're all forced into a position where, like, we have to make huge decisions based on things that we don't know firsthand. And I think
Well,
that's a
what I do know
very,
firsthand is having gone to Belarus, Mexico, Serbia, Turkey, and UK and Thailand during this whole thing. Thailand being an example of a country that basically got the virus under control very early on.
Mhm.
Recently had a second wave, but very early on, and seeing how that looked as a social cohesion, and seeing how that looked and what my part in that, and how willing I was to be a part in a society that seemed to be doing all the right things. Versus then I went to Belarus in July, and I saw a society that was doing nothing about it. And so from those two perspectives, I would say that those are the polar opposites, basically. And both of them were good approaches to it. But this politicized, for example, USA is an example of a country that's literally having the worst of both worlds, the worst of a bunch of individualist people who don't want to do anything to stop this thing, um, letting it spread, and then governments putting lockdowns on people at the same time, trying to use draconian force to keep it from spreading. I mean, the USA is the worst of both worlds. Belarus did nothing. It was fine. Their cases aren't that high, so it's hard to even tell what the lockdowns do. And Thailand did have very good social responsibility where everybody was from, like, I landed there on March the 1st last year in 2020, and everyone there was already wearing a mask, even though there was like something like 60 cases in the country, and they're all social distancing, washing their hands all the time, and they did it. So it's like Belarus or Thailand, pick one, but this in between thing is like, it's killing us. That's from, so I actually do have that experience of those countries.
Mhm.
And so it is in my actual experience to see the numbers based on how I saw people in different countries behaving. And that's why I think that I have a little bit more nuance on this thing rather than
Mhm.
people who are just in one political system and how they were dealing with it.
Yeah, it's so helpful to have like different contexts to be able to compare from.
Yeah.
I think what I was more referring to was the fact that like 95% of us aren't scientists,
Oh
and
yeah. Yeah, yeah,
we're
yeah.
like, I think it's just like it's such a vulnerable position to be placed in, to have to make such huge decisions based on faith in systems that like we don't understand. That might be understandable if we looked at the data, but we just don't have we so a lot of it, like I don't know how to read like a scientific report like that
And
really
the
kind of tries to get into
scientists,
these like different
and we
regression models and
we've also
stuff. And
seen that science is a very is a sort of thing where people go down rabbit holes where they have assumptions
yeah,
that guys,
yeah,
so
yeah.
a lot of people can't even trust the science, because
And
yeah.
part of what makes it hard to trust for some people is that when science is presented as politicized in some contexts or as more linked to certain groups or narratives than others, like for example, there's like I think that it's really cool that like if we're talking about like the debate like how science is positioned within like the climate change like narratives, right? There's been this very huge push to when people who are like for example on a more liberal side of that like saying like I believe in climate change because I believe in science. And so science is framed as like something that's like on one side of a polarized debate. People on the other side of that debate who might not again have the time to go through all these different things, they see science as politicized against them,
Yep.
right? And so then in that kind of context, like when you get something like this, it might be that might affect your ability to believe people who present themselves as representing science.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. And yeah, science, I mean, yeah, you can fund any study that you want and not publish the results if you don't like it, essentially. And
yeah, and
that's why there's a sense of mistrust. So it's like stuff like air pollution that we have here in Southeast Europe right now is very tangible, very real. You can see it, you can feel it. So that one, is very easy to understand. But yeah, climate change, very difficult to understand.
yeah, and so when
Coronavirus,
you
very
have
difficult to understand.
yeah, and when you have these things that are so huge and to a lot of people very abstract, and when they're bound up in concepts of identity, like when they get further bound up in our concept of identity, and when we moralize them, when they get tied up with moral values. And so when you were talking about what you're doing, like in your daily life, what you do or what you don't do, a lot of these choices for a lot of different people get tied up in a moral narrative.
Yeah.
Like I am a good person because I do this.
Yeah, I know.
And when that becomes linked to your identity, and if that becomes linked to a polarized identity, like I do this because this is good, which then frames the other person as like they do this because they're bad, or because they have like evil motivations, like that makes it so much harder to talk about are there legitimately different ways of approaching this? Because we might start thinking another way to do it is more evil. And like we might look
Yeah,
at it from a
it's
moral
hard to
frame. instead of looking at
contradictory
evidence.
perspectives become difficult to when it's your identity, and yeah, it's hard to think of that. So I mean, that's how
Yeah.
most people think, and that's how if you want to be a leader of people, and having had my own band, having had my own business, you do have to motivate people. You do need to get people on board, whatever you're leading, whatever it is that you need to actually drive towards a result in a direction and stuff like that. You do need to
Mhm.
win people over on an emotional level. And this is
Mhm.
this is how I think I like to look at the world. Is you've got people who are looking for that, and they're looking for the cause to join. They're looking for the thing that's going to make their life better, and they're looking for people who are going to come and give that to them. And
Mhm.
but like the thing about business that I like, and you know you get to sign up to the one that you want. The thing about government is like, well, we have these ideas of democracy. It doesn't really seem like anymore it's that effective in representing people, and their interests across a whole society in the age of fragmentation, of the level of fragmentation that we've got now with information on the internet, and the age of fragmentation that we've got in terms of the amount of consumer goods that are out there, and the amount of different things that. So I mean, my solution to the problem was I just went to a country where I felt like I could have a choice and a lifestyle that was closer to what I instinctively felt I belonged to. And North America was no longer that, because it seemed to be very much dominated by this capitalist narrative, which was, which I literally saw like really degrading the food supply, really degrading the medical system and all that stuff. And I call it predatory capitalism, the way specifically the legal food and medical systems in North America are run. And I'm all ears on how we can solve this problem. And, but it tends to be only people of my sort of like thoroughly secure upbringing and privileged background that tend to even have these ideas. And so
And
it's like,
it's
yeah.
that makes it hard because they might not have access or awareness of what the needs of other people or other groups are,
Well,
you know?
when you run a business, you do. You hire people, and you being a business owner and hiring people to do jobs, like
Mhm.
you have to actually get an idea of what people's needs are, and it's a different relationship. You're in a different position
Yeah.
with them,
And
and
that,
yeah, that's
I
what
think it's cool
leadership
when it's in
is.
a I think it's cool when it's in a business context, but a lot of people aren't business people, right? Or they might, for example, they might be in academia, which is even more removed from like a lot of different people, or they
Yeah,
might
that's my
be,
problem with that.
yeah. And so like there's just a lot of different industries that are very far removed from people within other like contexts.
And science is
And
one
when
of those
those,
things, actually.
yeah, it can be. And it's like that's what kind of also contributes to this lack of linkages between groups,
Yeah.
that generates mutual understanding. And there's actually this very interesting like in terms of what can facilitate those linkages and like people understanding each other's needs a bit more. Like there was this really interesting study that was done after the Republican Trump primaries, I think, and they were trying to figure out which conservative communities or which Republican leaning communities were the ones that were like most resistant to Trump's rhetoric. And they found out it was in like a lot of these towns were ones in which these small scale institutions like sporting clubs or social stuff were actually still existing. And so like these small scale community-based institutions were places where people could get to know each other and their needs and stuff, right? So business might be one area where there's a lot of kind of like overlapping like points of contact. And so were these institutions, right? And these were accessible to everybody from all different spheres. And I don't like, I'm not super familiar. I've heard that there's like data about like um, why those institutions were kind of ravaged in like America. Like let's say like why there's less stuff like that and how that might also contribute to all this stuff. Um, but yeah, and so like when you again going back to your question like some time ago, like what can we do to kind of go beyond small conversations and small dialogues and like small Zoom meetings to like this kind of broader thing. Like one avenue that some people are looking into is trying to rehabilitate these small scale institutions. as meeting points.
And the greatest opportunity of our time is actually having these small sort of scale institutions be something that reaches globally, with like conversations like this that we're having across continents right now. It's no longer it's going to be your local community. It's going to be your global community of like-minded people, people who subscribe to my YouTube channel, people who are in contact with you in various means and stuff like that. That's what's beautiful, is that you can actually spread, if you have good ideas, if you have good recipes, even for food, but also for how to live life in a more whatever you want to say, efficient, sustainable, insert word that you think is better. If you have something that will work in that way, it's now possible to propagate that around the world to like-minded people. But that also presents the problem of bad information getting out there.
Yeah. I think like one interesting, like that's actually a very interesting kind of like thinking about like what do institutions look like when they're globalized and when they're on the internet? And like what do small communities look like when they're not geographically based but broad-based? Like one example of an institution that had like, or we could call it an institution, but maybe community is maybe a better word for it. Like we don't even have a lexicon for it yet.
Sorry.
No problem. Like one example of this kind of thing that creates basically that creates social fabric. Like this is the nugget. We want something that creates a social fabric. One thing that was like online and globalized and was huge and what brought us together was couchsurfing.
Yeah, exactly. And that if I had a religion, it would be couchsurfing. Like I always say that because I was so good, because my father really was on board with that as soon as because he had to hitchhike in the 70s and meet people on the street, as I know you did and I did and all that stuff. But couchsurfing gave you the idea to be able to meet like-minded people in places, not just find a place to stay, but have, I've met bandmates, I've met, all sorts of different people on couchsurfing that served all sorts of functions in my life, and not just, travel buddies or travel hosts and stuff like that. And it was the most amazing thing, but even that got, sort of corrupted, or how people perceive it, by the corporate agenda and all that stuff, which is a shame. But maybe.
And I think like also part of the next step is, how do we build social fabric between people who are not like-minded? And I think that's what people were trying to get at with these small scale institutions that were like local, because you're not self-selecting. If you're on couchsurfing, you're already self-selecting for people who are more interested in this, who might have a certain degree of openness or might have a certain degree of that. And so I think one of the big challenges right now is, how do you create spaces that are less self-sorting for those kinds of things, so you actually create linkages between people who might not be aware of each other's needs, might not be aware of each other's world. And I think that's something that we haven't developed yet. And I think that's something that is, for me at least, it's very interesting, but it's very hard to think about in a pragmatic way.
I just wanted to say something. I know this is kind of awkward, but I have to pee to the point where it's interfering with my focus. And I just wanted to show you, like, one person who I do think is doing a good job these days on YouTube is Russell Brand. And I'm just, while I go pee for 1 minute, I'm going to play one of his videos. I want to know what you think of his method of sharing information now, and what red flags or green flags or whatever you want to call it is arising from that. So I'm just going to play this and I'll be back in a second. Oh, and of course we got an ad. Oh, all right. So here we go.
They should pay your YouTube.
Oh my God. I
For the
did an incognito
endorsements.
browser. Okay, let's do this. I've got an ad blocker on this one.
Okay.
So can you hear it? Like when the last one you could hear.
As lockdowns continue and alienation and isolation increases, we ask, is the mental health crisis the real pandemic? And is anybody profiting or benefiting from this crisis?
A recent national study found the rate of depression has doubled on last year. The virus hasn't just increased loneliness, but also anxiety and uncertainty.
Doctors, charities and the police have warned of a rising tide of distress. According to research by the UK Centre for Mental Health, a staggering 10 million people almost 20% of the population will need either new or extra help as a direct consequence of the crisis.
And there's nothing like a blank staring mannequin facing down a cold and empty high street to conjure the image of a culture gone wrong. Some facts about mental health in the pandemic. The coronavirus crisis is said to pose the greatest threat to mental health since the Second World War. Calls to mental health helplines and prescriptions for antidepressants have reached an all-time high, with more than 6 million people in England receiving antidepressants in just 3 months, the highest figure on record. Meanwhile, in the US, the pandemic has seen a tripling of anxiety symptoms and a quadrupling of depression among adults compared with the previous year. Nearly half of Americans report the coronavirus crisis.
So that's a sample of what he's putting out there. Have you seen any of his other videos lately?
Nope, never. I don't follow Russell Brand, so that was interesting.
So he's an entertainer, but I feel that he's got a sort of very balanced way of looking at stuff, but it's sort of anti-capitalist, anti-elite, anti-lockdown sort of weird sort of thing. Whereas these are, in some places considered contradictory ideas, right? That, because people would say that a more humanitarian, more left-wing sort of perspective these days would be, we need to save as many lives as possible. But then and anti-lockdown is mostly people who are like individual rights right-wing, which has become a right-wing narrative now. But he's like somebody who's combining more left-wing sort of traditionally left-wing sort of inequality arguments with an little bit of a who's benefiting from this lockdown sort of thing, which could be viewed as right-wing, but yeah, I don't know. What do you think of that?
Like, I think it's always good when people try to expand like the discussion of these narratives, using language that's accessible to both sides, right? So
and accessible to ordinary people. He's got this really relatable sort of working class British accent.
And like all these different cultural cues that might trigger somebody or not trigger somebody, right? Like that's obviously, you can't, like, there's only so much you can think about things like that, because we're all just human too. But like, I think the gold mine would be if a person can talk about kind of criticize lockdown through a language of care and through a language of justice. That might be more kind of
rather than individual rights, which is an easy one to discount. It's easy to say individual rights are not important in a pandemic because somebody's grandmother is going to die. But when you talk about mental health, those inequality,
those are these conflicts of value, or like values that people have, like care over like individual freedom, or for example, like prosperity over certain like elements of mental health. No matter what the conflict we're talking about is, like they're like each side has their values lined up. And so I didn't watch too much of the video, so I can't say, but like if Russell Brand is able to find a way to talk about one side using the language of the other side, then that would be that would already be progress, I think.
I mean, I think he's got a reactionary narrative and a sort of like anti-establishment narrative, which is always very powerful. And it used to be, like when I was growing up, I remember the whole goalpost of collectivism versus individualism has changed, because when we were growing up, it was like it was the religious sort of right wing that was the trying to get stuff banned, right? Based on their collectivist religious, Marilyn Manson is so outrageous, sort of like this is bad, it's going to destroy the purity of the thought of and now it's the left wing that's using a collective. So this is like
and now the left is persecuting Marilyn Manson,
for example. Let's not go to sexual abuse, like that's a whole other thing, but right. But basically it's like, but what I see when I look at spiral dynamics, the religious thing, society's evolving because the religious thing now became the individualist thing, which is focused on prosperity, which is a stage higher than the religious collectivism blue. It's the orange one. And now the left wing is more like the progressive sort of green thing, which is like, rights of everybody, trying to get a better world for all sort of thing. But it's so strange how that whole thing has shifted, and now Now,
Yeah.
yeah, the individualist narrative is seen as a right-wing thing, whereas before the left wing was like, we need more rights for everybody. We
Mhm.
need, now it's like,
Mhm.
well, we need to actually police these narratives on Facebook and YouTube and stuff like that. So
I think that a lot of this too is like at least in part a result of like where we see cultural power as relying. And like, so for example, before in the past, like it was the left that was considered the underdog, like the left that were considered the rebels, right? Whereas now, and obviously there are different like different centers of power in each society, right? But like in terms of if we think about like cultural media stuff like that, like that's in a number of ways a lot of those kind of manifest certain more like values associated with the liberal left, right? And so that's kind of in a position of power right now. And so to rebel against that is seen as like a right wing thing, right? And so now rebellion is being coded as something problematic, whereas before it was coded as something very positive and virtuous, almost even, right? And so I like for me, I look at things through a frame of polarization, right, and how
yeah,
polarization affects things. So this shift, like that you're talking about in terms of like the religious right in the past, and like now this kind of like the individual right now, like that. I feel like those poles shift because power dynamics shifted, and so polarization demanded that the new camps are formed along certain lines. So,
yeah,
for example, like in the past during this religious right like phenomenon that you're talking about, libertarians were coded as left because they were socially progressive, right?
yeah.
Whereas now libertarians are coded as right because they're about individual like responsibility and actions and stuff, right? And so like tracking how groups polarize into different camps like might say a lot about like the issues that force us into like to be like into those positions, you know what I mean? So it's like it's very fascinating, and the positions change so much sometimes and so fast that it's hard to track like the evolution of that.
And being somebody who always tries to be in the middle, I can appreciate all sides and what they have to say. That's kind of how I was raised, kind of how I like to be, and I think you're the same, because it's like you have to understand like what motivates these people. What like I have a great amount of sympathy for people who are just trying to make a living and are, caught in this lockdown and literally told they can't work, and it's like, really, yeah, I don't know. It's a horrible situation, really horrible situation. And you have to realize that the whole situation of literally like North Americans living off of credit is something that in a more grounded society, doesn't really happen as much, right? And so the whole situation now is like the whole capitalist system of the North America. It's kind of like it's all coming to roost in terms of like, people have been sold this mass marketed vision of life, and now it's all coming apart at the seams, and obviously they're going to go in different directions and polarize in different ways. And I don't think there's a real like good thing that can come out of this as things are. Like what would your solution be to the economic inequality that the lockdowns are leading to? I mean, like if you were trying to find a solution to, because I would tell you what I would do, but I don't know, what are your thoughts? What would you do? What's a fair system?
like I don't know, like how much of like the past like millennia philosophy, like political philosophy is like, what's a fair system? You know, like I'm
Yeah,
very
but
uninformed. You know what I mean? Like um I think that something that needs to happen is there needs to be structures where people feel like listened to and seen.
or
Um
at least fed and housed.
yeah, and it's like because I think that a lot of these issues, like I think a lot of things that prevent us from being like fed and housed and stuff like that is like are these political issues, right? So like there's gridlock in Congress over simple things that should just be like obvious, like okay, this is beneficial, we need to do that. But I think this kind of gridlock again comes down to this like this polarization and stuff like that. It becomes harder to like rally around these issues that are really just like, like let's just get people fed, you
and
know.
and I
And
feel
so we
like,
have to kind of
yeah.
like like deal with this like baggage basically, and a part of that baggage does come down to again like to what extent do I feel like can I work with this person, across
Yeah,
the how
but
can we
at the same time
collaborate.
you have now you have a system like Facebook that managed to create a social fabric that we all have our little stake in.
Yeah.
And these systems of information. So if you look at the ideals that were sort of like the socialist ideals that led to, you know, brutal communist regimes in the 20th century, they were good ideals. But what happened was corruption. What happened was collectivism.
Yeah.
What happened was the need to suppress people because there weren't enough resources to really or enough organization to distribute those resources in a way that wouldn't fall prey to corruption. But I feel now in the 21st century there actually would be a chance to, through the algorithms, that same sort of algorithms that are making sure that you're getting YouTube videos that you think are interesting would mean that you have food at your door and a place to sleep at night for everybody, and that nobody's talking about. People are talking about universal basic income, but they're not talking about universal basics. You know, like I feel that, yeah, you could keep a capitalist society on top of a system that uses some sort of basic allocation of food and accommodation and clothing and medical care and all that stuff. But the problem is that the food and medical companies are the biggest companies in the world, and they have so much lobby power over government. It's not going to happen without a serious like upheaval of social order, because the people, those companies just have too much power over the way things are, and they think that they're so great, and they're in their sort of echo chamber of yes men and all this stuff, and they've got the politicians like influenced and all that stuff, and you know, like no politician would be able to steer that in on a different course in a 4-year cycle. And so what needs to happen is actually it does need to be some sort of evolution or revolution, and it's not going to be nice, because the values of the society are too much on this capitalist thing now, and they're slowly shifting into a more equitable thinking, this green thing of, you know, social justice and all that stuff. But at the same time, that's being manipulated by the media so much, and corporations so much, and large companies. I'm not saying that large companies are bad. I'm saying that they just evolved in a system that was very much focused on profit. So when I run my own company, I'm focused on the well-being and making a win-win-win for everybody involved. And that's my main metric, is like, does it feel good for me running this company, the managers I have managing these contracts of people working, running the outsourcing company of people working remotely? Are the people happy? Do they like the work they're doing? Do they have a fair environment? Are they growing their career? Are the companies happy? Are they saving money? All that sort of stuff. But society has not been organized like that previously, because the information was not there. Everything was local, and a local structure could only evolve to a point where you only know what's local. And if you wanted to go and get higher knowledge, you had to go to a university. Whereas now you can learn a lot about the world from YouTube, but it's what to focus on, with the algorithms giving you bullshit all the time based on your own echo chamber. And I don't know, I just said a lot of stuff. What came up for you?
Like, I think like you're talking also about like a very like another like a very age-old question, just like how do you address like structural power systems in a way that doesn't like screw everything up for everybody and make everybody even more vulnerable?
Yeah,
Like,
I
you know
mean,
what I mean?
yeah. Well, you know
And like,
that, yeah, it's questionable what's going to happen with the economy now, after
yeah.
18% of the US dollars in existence got created last year, for example. That's a statistic that is very
Mhm,
worrying to a lot of people now. And the
mhm.
Federal Reserve just says they can keep on printing money. That's what they said.
Yeah, and it's like,
So it's like
and it's
everything's in question now. But I
yeah,
feel that if there is a collapse, that it might be the shock that's needed to actually have people say, hey, wait a second, you know, it's not going to be like the 1930s where, well, hopefully not, where you get Hitler, you know, like
but like,
something like that, you know,
but the thing is like with, for
that's the
example, we look
danger.
at like, yeah, like if we look at the like what like the like what happened after the Second World War, what happened after the First World War, like after like what led to like part of what led to Hitler was like war
Making Germans
over,
poor.
we
Yeah,
win, yeah, like just like revenge and this kind of like not engage, but like put a cap on it, right?
exactly.
Whereas like World War II, depending on where it was, like in China it was completely different, but like
Yeah.
after World War II, at least in Europe, It was like, or in North America, even more so, just like, yeah, like rebuild. You know, like we're
There
so
was also
sick
other aspects to
of
that
like
though.
all this
Like
stuff.
there was
It is very complicated,
yes,
but like
okay,
it's
so I can
like
speak
there are
on
these different
this is
responses.
actually tied directly into my family history and why I was born in Canada. Actually,
Hmm.
this thing. So after World War One, my family were ethnic Germans from Bratislava, which used to be called Pressburg, was its German name. It was part of the Kingdom of Hungary in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And after World War One, Austria-Hungary was defeated and it became Czechoslovakia, where my grandparents grew up. But being relatively affluent, well, essentially old aristocracy in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they were able to prosper somehow in the new Czechoslovakia, which was a capitalist system. After it rebuilt, they got through. The 30s were good, but still you had this nationalism that occurred, and then
Hmm.
the Nazis took over, and the war happened, and my grandfather, his thing was he escaped the front once and just did everything to avoid military service, basically to avoid fighting and dying. And he was there when he escaped from the Russian front when that winter that they all died because Hitler thought they had enough power to take Moscow before winter came in, and he got off that front in November. So this is the survival that's built into me. But then what happened after the war, when the Russians came and started instituting their communism, and Tito took over Yugoslavia, there was an administrative decision that actually all of us ethnic Germans from Czechoslovakia, from Yugoslavia, and all that stuff, we had to go. You had to leave because they thought, in addition to this time, we're going to actually invest economically in these countries, but we can't have these people that we just defeated stick around because they're the traditional ruling class in countries like Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia and so on and so forth. And so there was, and when you look back, maybe that was a good decision, but it was ethnic cleansing, right? So this is a good example of policy and how it works. So yes, and then guess what? My grandfather left Czechoslovakia, moved to Austria because they didn't really have a choice. Because even though they spoke Slovak as one of their first languages, their names involved them in the German ethnicity, and so they had to leave. Essentially, went to Austria, and then my family got some through the family connections, got some money invested in a company based on the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, and with that wealth managed to move to Canada. So that's why I was born in Canada as the first generation of my family. And so it's interesting, the whole policy of expelling us from our home, and also then the next policy was investing, and then we moved to Canada. So that it's like it's kind of a personal story, but it relates to a lot of these things of like how it's like you might have to do something like lock people down and destroy their livelihood to achieve a greater thing later. But it doesn't seem like there's a plan like that in this whole thing. It doesn't seem like there's. So if I look at that, I'm really glad that I grew up in Canada in a nice neighborhood. Really glad. It was great growing up in Toronto in affluent surroundings. That was great. But how we got there was absolutely awful. Having Russian soldiers come to your house and put daggers to my grandfather's neck and all that stuff. And so that's life. It's nuanced. It's crazy. But I don't hold any resentment, even though my grandparents, they still hold some resentment for the way that the communists, took everything, and the parts of the family that stayed, they lost everything to communism because, that's what they did to the upper classes, and they're lucky they survived, basically. So. I mean, it's like so. I don't know why I wanted to tell this story, but yeah, it's my personal connection to. Yes, the second time around, not only did they kick us out of our home city, but they put money in our pockets, and I'm happy, but I'm also happy that I moved back to Europe. So.
Like one thing that like one element of just what you were saying here, but also when we're talking about like how the Germans were responded to after like the First World War, is this idea of how do you how do you relate to somebody? How do you relate to like the other side? Or like after do you integrate the losers? Like
Absolutely, you
or
have
do
to, or
you
else
defeat
what?
or do you defeat and dominate them? You know?
That's the problem with cancel culture now, isn't it? That, I mean,
Like but that's it. Like when we're like I feel like a broken record, but like one of the things that's interesting when we start thinking about these cultural conflicts, like we think about armed conflicts, like now we wouldn't think about domination as as an acceptable like tactic or end goal of like of an armed conflict, right? At least within this kind of like socially liberal sphere, right? Like in other spheres, absolutely, like domination is still like a strategy, but now it's not. Like now it's about integration. Now it's about like figuring out what are the different sides and stuff like that. But when it comes to cultural conflict, domination is still a very active. Uh, it's still got like cultural currency in the sense that if we see an idea or a cultural group that we deem dangerous, like the idea to dominate and to defeat is very strong. And this is where we get a lot of comparisons to Nazis, right? And so like if you compare somebody to a Nazi, like it's easy to get that domination language because like the last war that we see is like that there's a narrative that like the last just war for like decimation was World War II because the Nazis had to be stopped, which was like and like it's and so now when people use that kind of language on a cultural level, it's like there's this language of engagement and this narrative of engagement does not have as much currency yet. Maybe in the future it will be, but I like my take on it is that with armed conflict, the language of engagement gained currency because we realize there isn't any other way. You know, if we don't want this cycle of conflict of violence to continue, right?
yeah.
And so
So
it's something.
how does that relate to the modern day North American culture
So
separation?
we haven't learned that, you know, like we don't like we think that oh if we dominate, you know, like we'll be on the right side of history, we will prevail, we will educate our children, and then in the future we won't have this issue. Like there's almost this kind of like there can be this narrative like kind of like that, which we can discuss because it's a very, you know, like obviously I'm oversimplifying it, but like there's this idea that sometimes we just have to wait and like progress will move on, or like however progress you frame progress, right? Because people frame progress in very different ways.
Well,
But this
yeah.
idea of what to do to integrate all the people who disagree with you, that's a conversation that we're not having.
Well, this is where ideology really is hazardous, I think, because if you look at basic human needs and survival on a level, anybody who's lived in a country with a certain amount of corruption will know that everybody has their price, and if you give them some money, they'll likely be on your side all of a sudden. So apply that to a social level, and basically, the reason people feel disadvantaged is basically because they feel disadvantaged, like economically their survival is threatened. And if you can just make a social system that, like Canada is a great example, Scandinavia is a great example of systems that for a long time have
Mhm.
been pretty fair and pretty free of large social issues where people felt disadvantaged. And you know, it's actually shown by the way that people actually had a decent standard of living, and poverty was not a huge thing like it is in the United States. For example, in Canada, we know that we have a much fairer system than the United States, and we have a much more peaceful country than the United States if you look at the crime statistics and if you look at the polarization of ideas. And so it's not about ideal. If people just say, look, it's we have to set aside ideology. Ideology is toxic in nature because it creates these blind spots in reality. It creates adversarial perceived adversarial relationships between people who probably have more in common than they don't have in common. And well, it yeah, and this is we've made great progress as a human race in this area of eradicating a lot of these problems like poverty, starvation, disease, and stuff like that over the last 50 years, and it's looking good. But to see inequality rising in the last decade or 2 decades is very alarming to this progress, isn't it? And
Yeah, and I think like another issue to add to all these other issues that we're talking about is how like the way that we frame the needs that need to be addressed is often framed by our ideology or our value systems,
yeah,
right? So for some people, prosperity is can be measured in economic terms. For other people, it's measured in economic, but also well-being in general. Or and there's all these other different needs. Like, what does it mean to feel belonging? You know, and is belonging a need that we have to address? And like things like that. And so, um, like it's we don't have a common understanding of what needs need to be addressed. And sometimes we have competing ideas of needs, and like these conflicts can become like more entrenched because of that. And so like if we have these like divided societies, right, maybe we won't recognize that the other side also needs to belong. Maybe they also
yeah.
feel, you know what I mean? And so it's like we might not be able to even think about how to integrate if we don't recognize, like, for example, for some people they feel like they have a need to culturally exist with their ideologies and with their values and with their religion or with their political affiliation. And like sometimes those very things are what comes under attack by other people. So it's very complicated because people frame it in such different ways.
But yeah, I mean, the thing's gonna get better if we just find a way to give everybody a decent living, decent baseline. You know, the world does become more peaceful. I don't think it's possible to have a World War III that looks anything like World War II or World War One because we've just come so far, and people would not like. Certainly, it would take a really huge catastrophe
Mhm.
economically and actually like a lot of hunger, starvation, and poverty to get people to the level where they would feel like the circumstances that led to a rise of someone like Hitler and the Nazi movement.
Mhm.
It would take a lot to do that in at least Europe and North America,
Mhm.
and we're not going back there. I don't think we are. I could be wrong, but some really bad stuff would have to happen for us to go back there because
Mhm.
the ideas have evolved.
Mhm.
But other countries, it's possible. But hopefully, I mean, I have this contradictory, you know, Americans think that if they just go and give everybody like shopping malls and McDonald's and cars and houses and everybody has all that stuff, they're not gonna be extremist anymore. And that's what America tries to do in places like Iraq and stuff like that. I think it fails. You have things like ISIS popping up because they're not playing a long enough game. The political cycle is like, yeah, it's not a
So
long enough game.
what are the needs? What are the extra needs that are not being addressed by shopping malls and McDonald's?
Oh, well, it's to give it takes it's for the ideology to evolve around it. It's not going to happen in 5 years where people are going to be starving and then suddenly they've got everything. And yeah, it's also that the when people go from traditional values to this capitalist system, lots of people want to preserve those traditional values, right? And so there's a certain cognitive dissonance that comes trying to bring people into prosperity when they've all basically exist. People have to go through their own volition into a new stage of prosperity, and society has to shift in its narrative with education and all that stuff, and it takes a generation or something. If you look at Turkey as a fascinating example of a country that very much made great leaps and bounds in the 20th century to become modernized and become a stable society. And that stability is still something that remains, even though the government receded into a more religious, nationalistic, whatever you want to call it, sort of situation. But still, you have lots of very liberal, westernized people there who, And it's like you've got both there. And then, but that's the stability of that country means that where I am in Serbia today is not threatened by Islamic extremism at all. Otherwise, it would be. It would be possible that, if Turkey had if Turkey had a weaker government, that Islamic extremism could spread there and then here and then to other parts of Europe and all that stuff. And I'm not saying that Islamic extremism is something that is bad. I'm saying that if you understand how it works, that prosperity is the solution to extremism, right? And Turkey is a great country that took those steps, and that the Americans didn't play, and the whole Middle East is basically nobody in there has gone in and played enough of a long game in doing it. So you get these like sort of cycles of regression into violence, basically, because they haven't had like a long enough game to get out of that. Does that make sense?
Like, I think we can definitely, like, better fed people, healthier people, people with less anxiety.
Yet Iran,
Oh,
it's like, oh, Iran, let's put more sanctions on them. How's that going to help? Like, honestly,
it's again,
Russia, let's put more sanctions on them. How's that going to, right? It doesn't help.
There's been this there's been this really interesting kind of development over the past like couple decades. This kind of like research into what we call like identity-based conflict, where if people feel like core identities or group psychology or group loyalty is threatened or by something, then like it can prompt these huge reactions that might seem really incomprehensible, when there's so many other big things that we need to do, right? So it's like, and so it's not only like Iran or Russia, and we need to like sanction them, but it's also a way to validate ourselves,
of course,
and to validate our position. And so it's like, and that means that if we have a need to validate ourselves, then that means that there's a need that we're trying to meet, and so we can also start thinking about those needs. Like, why do I need to validate myself? Why do I feel threatened enough that I need to validate myself, right? And so like looking at those kind of factors might also kind of help us address the reasons why we're not helping everybody prosper.
Well, if you look at spiral dynamics, what happens when you threaten traditional society on the blue level is it recedes into red, which is basically like violence. That's where violence is. It's on the red stage, and it's an individualist stage. It's ego driven, and it's just like, I'm going to take what I need to survive. And it's criminals think this way, and that's what happened in the Balkans in the 90s, is that it regressed into people just saying, this society is no longer cohesive. I'm going to watch out for my tribe, myself, I'm going to try to get rich off of arms deals, selling weapons, whatever it is. And it's so predictable. It's so predictable. Yeah. And that's the danger. I think it
becomes really interesting then to start thinking about, okay, how can we track the ways that certain people regress, right? Like what are the vulnerabilities that this particular group has that might make them regress into this kind of stage, right? So there's the, like, how do we make people more resilient against
definitely American intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq is a pretty good recipe for radicalizing the population, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Like, yeah, and it's like, but that was, and that's the second thing, right? The first thing is like, how do we like make people resilient to aggression? Like the other thing is like, how do we like deal with the blocks that prevent us from like regressing, right? And so like there were reasons why like people went to Iraq or to Afghanistan, right? That like and what are, and those, if we see those actions like blocks that are preventing us from doing this work, what's motivating those blocks, right? And so like that's the kind of work that we have to like be doing as like a collective to understand like why these things happen, what needs they served, and can those needs be met using less problematic strategies, right?
Yeah.
And that's like another one of these like $1 million questions.
It can't be met by global capitalism as a system. It can be met by Like so many countries have come so far. Like, like if you look at Eastern Europe, if you look at Southeast Asia, if you look at Latin America, these places are getting thoroughly better. They're getting more stable. Places like Colombia, Serbia, Vietnam, all these places are just on the rise. And it's good. It's good. We're getting there. But now who knows what's going to happen with this economic situation now. That's kind of what I fear for. And even I recede into a little bit of self-preservation, just wanting to guard myself against a financial collapse, invest
I,
in some precious metals, invest in some land, that sort of thing that gets on your mind when you hear statistics like 18% of US dollars were created last year. And when you look at this lockdown, cash handouts and all that stuff, not sustainable and stuff like, you think, what am I going to do? What am I going to do if this whole system that, has been really doing me very well as a, affluent Canadian my whole life, what if this all falls down immediately? What if this all just like vanishes in a heartbeat and doesn't look like it's going to vanish just like that? Because I don't think anybody wants that to happen, but it's not going in a good direction. And it hasn't been going in a good direction since 2008. It hasn't.
Yeah, and I think if nothing else, like the whole pandemic situation might be a really good opportunity to kind of generate solidarity in the sense that a lot of people who don't necessarily feel insecure on a regular basis might start feeling insecure. Um, and if nothing else, that might be a very good space to kind of generate reflection on, okay, so what does like I feel secure normally. Like if I'm feeling insecure now, like what does insecurity look like for different people, and like how are they using problematic strategies to meet legitimate needs?
Well, you
And
know
like
what?
and being in touch with that like with that reality in some small way in myself, it might help open me up
And
to influence.
the saddest thing for me is having done business in places like Central London Financial District.
Mhm.
I know how many of the richest people in this world operate out of a survival mentality, you know?
Mhm.
Like I've known people who have for example cocaine addictions who are incredibly wealthy and but they feel threatened if you in a business meeting question their ideas. They go into that survival mode, and these are some of the most powerful people, and they can rise to the top of the current system because it's based on business and profit, and they're hardworking enough to drive that, and their whole strategy of being super competitive and being super conniving, and they basically exist within the boundaries of the law, but they'll fuck anybody over like to make more money and all that stuff, and they never stop playing that game no matter how rich they are, because they've linked um their dopamine or whatever hormonal system to getting more money, and so they continue to behave like that. And that's the scary part of our current system, is it has rewarded that type of insensitive behavior. And that's what I call
Social algorithms,
that's
right?
exactly, yeah, that's exactly why I call it predatory capitalism, the way that
Yeah.
these corporations are run. And I've seen it. I've been in these neighborhoods, I've been in these financial districts, and I've met these people. There's lots of the neighborhood I grew up in, Toronto, had lots of old money Anglo-Saxon type people, and they were cool, most of them. But the most dangerous are the social climber people who have this survival mentality and will just like pillage within the bounds of the law.
Mhm.
And I think that's why I like Russell Brand is and his recent videos, which you can check out, because he kind of highlights this, having himself been somebody who's done lots of meditation and work about his consciousness, and I like it, and we need more people to do that work, and less opportunity for people who are essentially hypocrites who are out for themselves, virtue
Mhm.
signaling that they have some sort of social agenda, hiding behind corporations and NGOs and whatever it is. We need to actually get more to people in truth, and people actually being able to explain themselves in a long format conversation like this why their values are being applied and why they should be leaders of our society, because the politicians are those same types of people that I'm talking about in the financial district. It's competitive, you know? So we need a less competitive world, is what I'm saying. Does that make sense?
Like, obviously,
We
there's like lots, like, there's
we
always
have a
lots.
lot of resources for everybody
Yeah,
now.
yeah. It's like there's just so much bullshit, and like, you know what I mean. And it's like it's interesting because you like, again, like at the very beginning we talked about, okay, how do we like we like it's easier to try to build small communities where these kinds of dynamics are going to be less
I don't think it is,
able
though.
to like, but I mean, like,
Have you
they're
ever tried?
like some people, like if I could finish, like,
Okay.
there's this, like, some people are able to build, like, for example, small communities, like different stuff like that, where like some of these dynamics are less like threatening or damaging. But how do we like do this in terms of a culture at large? And it's like, this is,
Actually, I think
that's
no. Every time you have a small community, like a band is my main experience with this, but also people who have tried starting their own hippie communes and stuff like that. They have the same sort of problems of individualism versus collectivism,
yeah.
arguments between people. I truly believe in a sort of like someone who has leadership in a certain area, has a vision, has some values, makes systems like that embody those values, and gets people to sort of buy into their vision, and people who want to be a part of those values and stuff like that, they do really well. But there has to be some sort of hierarchy there. That's the problem. And where there's a hierarchy, there's competition to get to the top of it. So I try to run my business like that. We've got about 70 people around the world right now working through my business, and I try to embody those values. And that's my little piece. I want to grow this thing. I want to
Yeah.
make it run with the values, but it gets
And we need
harder
more
as you get
people.
more
Yeah.
personalities involved. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, we need more people who are doing more in their small piece and potentially building like linkages between them. So like, but it's complicated,
We
but like
don't lack people to be led.
it's
We lack leaders to lead them, is one personal development phrase at a seminar that I went to once.
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah.
leadership is one of the leadership from a point of values is what we're missing in the society, I think.
Mhm.
And it's something that requires academics, it's something that requires artists, and it's something that requires politicians and business leaders to all sort of get on the same page with. And it's difficult, but I understand you have to go. And this has been almost 2 hours. It's been a wonderful conversation. We'll do this again. I hope some people watch this, because this, for me, it's fascinating. And I'll look back on this like later in my life, I'm sure, unless YouTube deletes me, and be able
Save
to
everything. Save every, like, okay, takeaway. Like, not even like
let's
threat
sum
and
up
like
with that.
this
Yeah,
and
what's
that.
your biggest takeaway?
Save all your shit. Like,
You don't
somewhere
you don't
else and
own your
not on Google
Facebook
Drive.
account. You don't own. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks
Moral
a
of the
lot,
story.
Josh. Yeah, thanks a lot. I think there's a lot to unpack here, and
Yeah.
let's talk again in a few months and see how the
Okay.
world looks different then. All right.
Hopefully it looks a little different.
It's frightening, isn't it?
Maybe we'll do this in
I
person
hope the
next year.
vaccines work. Jesus, like that's my sincere hope, is that they work and that we can stop this nonsense. So,
Okay.
all right, I'm
Excellent.
gonna hit
Thank you for
stop
having
now.
me on.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Josh.
Okay.